All right. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Ying. Today, I'll be presenting on some work that I've done in collaboration with Professor Daniel Kissling at the University of Amsterdam. And basically, the aims of this study was to really evaluate the impact that past defaunation of huge megafaunal seed dispersers may have and their impact on palm communities. And to also examine like how the loss of large animal seed dispersers may influence plant communities in the future. So to kind of start off, seed dispersal is a really important part of the life history of plants. As we all know, as botanists, plants are basically sessile, and so they interact with their environment in a very direct way. And the only way in which they can kind of adjust is really to adjust their populations to any abiotic or biotic change is really through seed dispersal. It's an important part of the life history of plants in the way that it allows for the colonization of favorable sites and also reduces mortality from competition or density dependent factors such as Jensen-Connell effects. So as a result, it is really one of the fundamental processes governing plant community dynamics. So it's not just at the population scale, but it also affects kind of the composition of plant communities as a whole. Given the importance of seed dispersal, it is not surprising to note that many plants have evolved fruits or seeds to be dispersed by fruit-eating animals. So this could be the evolution of fleshy kind of tissue in the fruit, or kind of fleshy kind of tissue around the seed. Different ways in which they attract animals through scent, through color, through the way that the fruit are presented on the plant itself. And this has proven to be a remarkably great strategy. In tropical forests, between 70 to 90% of woody species are actually animal dispersed, which is a great testament to how important animal seed dispersal is in like shaping tropical plant communities. Of note are of course large mammals. So for example, large mammals like African elephants, tapirs, for example, they play disproportionate roles as seed dispersers because they are able to, they have greater gut capacity and gut retention times, as well as their ability to travel large distances also allows them to be able to disperse more seeds and larger seeds over greater distances. So a study by Macias Pires in 2018 in ecography did a simulation study of the movement of such mammals and showed that something as big as an elephant could move seeds up to like 1.5 kilometers, whereas a peccary or a small sized mammal may only move like a very small fraction of that. So this underscores the importance of not just seed dispersers in general, but also very large bodied animals playing that role. So given that this is a palm conference, I would be kind of remiss to kind of go through kind of the importance of animal seed dispersal for our very favorite group of plants, the palms. So the palms are keystone fruit resources in many tropical and subtropical areas. So in some parts of the Amazon basin, 30 to 50% of the dry mass of all fruit is really palm, originates from palms. The group itself, with over 2,500 species, really predominantly animal dispersed, with just a few exceptions like the coco de mer or the humble coconut, and maybe the mangrove palm, Nipa fruticans. And as Scott Zona and Henderson kind of did this beautiful review in 1989, showing that a huge variety of animals actually perform some kind of seed dispersal service for various palm species, from birds, mammals, to even reptiles, insects, and even some species of fish. Palm fruits themselves vary greatly in both size, shape, and color, from about 3 millimeter to like 45 centimeter big fruit sizes, for example. And of course, if you look at the palm, if you look at the distribution of large fruits in the palm family, many different lineages from across the different subfamilies have evolved large fruits, which are thought to be dispersed by large-bodied mammals and birds, for example. This include the salaka among the calamoids, Mauritia, which is a fairly large fruited palm, to the boresoid fan palms, and to the ones that might be more familiar to people who in the neotropics, including groups like Astrocarium and Attalea, for example. One of the big issues with the importance, one of the big implications of the importance of animal seed disperser in tropical communities is that one of the big hallmarks of mankind's kind of impact on natural ecosystems has really been the removal of such potential seed dispersers. So, for example, that there's been various reports, like for example, the Living Planet report has suggested that of all the vertebrate species for which they have data, on average, vertebrate populations have decreased by about 60%. So, and of course, this is a population level average in many parts of the world. Large body mammals, many of which are seed dispersers, have already been completely extirpated and hence functionally extinct from those areas. But of course, mankind has been doing this for a very long time. Ever since anatomically modern Homo sapiens has left our ancestral kind of continent of Africa several 100,000 years ago, our migration across the world has also precipitated widespread ecological disruption, including the loss of animal populations through hunting. So, for example, it's widely thought that changes in climate and also human arrival have led to the extinction of many large-bodied mammals since the last interglacial. So, if you look at this figure on the right by Anthony Barnowski in 2004, you can see that the arrival of man is indicated by those icons of the man with a spear almost always coincide with the timing of the disappearance of many large bodied mammals in the fossil record. So those are indicated by those kind of circles, for example. And more recent work has shown that the number of extinction of mammal species greater than 10 kilograms since the last interglacial almost completely matches patterns of human dispersal. So on the left, you can see that the number of extinctions number of mammal extinctions is fairly low in the African continent, where it is particularly bad in areas like the neotropics, North America, and Australia, where humans actually migrated to last. And of course, as mentioned before, hunting and habitat loss that accompanies the movement of humans across the landscape threaten large mammals disproportionately, because as large mammals, they often have smaller population sizes, they have lower rates of population growth, and hence they are more vulnerable to these sorts of impacts relative to smaller bodied kind of mammals. This means that mammal communities are not only smaller than they were thousands of years ago, but given modern day patterns of extinction risk, it is likely that our animal communities will continue to downsize through time. However, the impact of this downsizing on animal-mediated seed dispersal and the well-being of many of these palm species that are dependent on it is unclear. But the fact that we have had this loss of megafauna in the past, since the late Pleistocene, provides us a very crucial kind of window to predicting how present-day ecosystems will be shaped by future defaunation, because we can actually look back at how palm communities have responded to these past extinctions. So to do this, first thing I did was to kind of compile patterns of fruit size at the global scale. And to do this, we basically use the World Checklist of Palm, which is of palms, which is now in the, I think it's the WCSP from the Kew Gardens, the world checklist of selected plant families. And these are basically just regional palm assemblages, so checklists of palm species at the scale of botanical countries. I then looked at I then used the fruit sizes that are available in the Palms Trait database, which has fruit size data for about 80% of species. And then for the remaining that we do not have data for, we just kind of took a genus level kind of mean. And when you do that, one pattern is quite immediately clear, is that fruit size really varies quite greatly across the globe. So for example, it's generally highest in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's kind of fairly middling or low in the parts of Central Africa, which are more dominated by tropical forests and hence have a lot more species that have smaller kind of fruit sizes. It's fairly big in the south, in the neotropics, and fruit size is generally lowest in the Indo-Malayan kind of region. So this is just looking at the maximum fruit size of botanical countries. And here I have excluded the Palearctic, Near Arctic, and Oceanic realms, as they usually have a very depauperate kind of palm fauna and palm flora, and they tend not to have that many animals that kind of disperse palms. So the next thing I did was to kind of look at what the mammal frugivores look like, both past and present. As I mentioned, we focus on mammals. So we focus on mammals primarily because they are highly important seed dispersers, including of many palm species. They have a fairly good Pleistocene fossil record, which allows us to really reconstruct what past frugivore assemblages would look like. To do this, we use the phyllocene database that was put together by Sue and Forby, who was one of our co-authors. And this data set has been published elsewhere. So we kind of looked at two different scenarios: the current scenario, which only includes extant species and their current ranges, and we also had an alternative one for the Pleistocene called the present natural scenario, which would have included all frugivores or potential frugivores from the last interglacial as well. So one of the things that was quite challenging with determining what the past frugivore assemblages would have looked like is that frugivory is not an interaction that lends itself well to inference from morphological traits. So if you think about the African elephants, they are predominantly grazers, and if you were to look at their dentition, they look like they are, highly adapted for, the consumption of grasses, right? Because they have these very large grinding molars, for example. However, like a substantial proportion of African elephants is actually on fruit, right? So the dentition is only a very indirect proxy and can often be a misleading proxy for the diet of past frugivores. So to kind of get around this, we relied on various sources. So not just the dentition, looking at dental wear, microwear patterns, we reviewed also the coprolites, whether there was evidence of frugivory. And we also looked at isotopic lines of evidence. So we kind of made the assumption that grazers would be least likely to be frugivores, whereas things that are mixed browsers are more likely to be frugivores. And we also gathered some evidence from modern day relatives. So for example, one of our cutoffs was that for a Pleistocene mammal to be considered a frugivore under our classification, that they should come from families where the preponderance of modern relatives were also frugivores. However, we also note that this kind of very coarse classification is not perfect. So, for example, if you look at the sloths, sloths nowadays, they're very small, they're completely arboreal, and they're basically 100% folivorous. Whereas in the past, in the neotropics, there existed huge sloths, weighing up to a few tons, right? And it's very unlikely that they would have been purely folivorous like their present day cousins would be. So to do that, we kind of had a whole different set of different classifications of different levels of conservativeness to kind of test our results and to see if they were robust to fauna taxa had enormous geographic ranges. Their imprint across space is actually quite great. So for example, the maximum body size of mammalian frugivore assemblages declined from about 600 to 52 kilograms, an 11-fold decrease at the global scale. This was particularly bad in the neotropics, where there was a 90-fold decrease in the maximum body size of a frugivore there. This number varies depending on which frugivore classification you use, but in general, the neotropics has had the most severe kind of frugivore extinction. So under our default kind of classification, whereas there were 11 putative frugivores over 1,000 kilograms at the end of the Pleistocene, or more rather 130,000 years ago. Now the largest frugivores are the tapirs, which are only about 100 to 200 kilograms. So this downsizing is actually quite severe. So let's see what happens. So the next thing that we tried to do was to see whether or not the maximum body size of frugivores was predictive of the fruit sizes for any given kind of region. So to do this, we kind of relied on a bunch of different models, which I will list here. But of course, if there are any questions about our modeling approach, please feel free to contact me or to look at the paper that was published. So we developed a bunch of generalized linear models and also spatial autoregressive models to deal with spatial autocorrelation. We use the maximum fruit size as the response variable. And for explanatory variables, we kind of looked at both the body size of the frugivore, past climate, and current climate. We fitted different models for different faunistic scenarios. So one with only extant mammals and one with both extant and the extinct ones. We did this for different, at the global scale, but also split up the world into 3 different biogeographic regions and analyzed it separately. Effect sizes were estimated using model averaging. So we fitted different combinations of these variables and then combined the models together to get an average of what the effect sizes should be. And the variance explained by each variable was then decomposed using this CAR-score kind of method. So one thing to note is in all the future graphs, yellow would represent the body sizes and the models where we only used extant mammals, and the dark blue would be for models where we use the body size of mammals when taking into account those past extinctions. So what we found was that there was a strong positive correlation between the sizes of the largest frugivores in a region and the size of the largest palm fruits in the region. So that means that if an area has much larger frugivores, they will also tend to have larger kind of fruit sizes, which makes sense. So this really shows that the presence of large frugivores is really crucial for maintaining the persistence of these large fruited palm species in certain regions. I understand that this is an indirect measure because, of course, we don't actually look at the diets of these frugivores per se, but I think it's a very strong indication that that it is given that some of the largest frugivores today, like the elephants, also disperse some of the very largest palm fruits. That this is probably the case that large body mammals probably play a big role in their kind of in their population dynamics, for example. This was also true when you accounted for extinct frugivores. So if you took into account all frugivores that went extinct since the last interglacial, you also see such a strong kind of statistical correlation between the largest frugivores and also the largest fruit sizes. There was an exception for the Afrotropics where we didn't really find a significant pattern. So this is very interesting, given that we know that large frugivores tend to eat larger fruits, but we don't see such a strong spatial pattern of areas with large fruits with the largest frugivores. This might be because despite trait matching, the size of frugivores versus the size of fruits, that more regional, like heterogeneity in the climate may play quite a big role in also shaping fruit sizes in the region as well. So when we looked at the variance that is explained by current versus present natural frugivore assemblages, so this we can see in the bar plot. So the bigger the bar plot, that means the greater the amount of variation in fruit size is explained by that particular variable. So when you look at this figure, you can see that current fruit size, which is on which is indicated by the yellow bars, are explained by the present-day frugivore assemblages much better. So the yellow bars are much larger than the dark blue bars in this case. The interpretation for this is that there is probably substantial ecological and evolutionary reorganization of palm assemblages over tens of thousands of years since these large mammals went extinct. However, there was a very interesting pattern in the neotropics where variation in fruit size was equally well explained by past frugivores, which I will try to explain in the next few slides. So when we think about the ecological and evolutionary responses to defaunation, one of the key mechanisms by which, or one of the key kind of responses would be to adapt to the remaining frugivore community. So there was a study by Mauro Galetti and colleagues that was published in 2013 basically showed that in forest fragments in the Atlantic forests where the largest frugivores went extinct, basically the toucans and toucanettes, seed sizes were about 0.1 centimeters or about 1 millimeter smaller in size than in areas where these birds still exist. And they basically showed that it was possible for rapid evolution to account for this difference, right? So because the large seeded palms, so by the way, they were looking at this through the lens of a particular Atlantic forest palm, Euterpe edulis. So basically larger seeded individuals of this palm in defaunated forests would have had a lower chance of being dispersed, which has kind of given rise to a direction of selection towards smaller seed sizes over several generations, about 200 years since defaunation. However, I would argue that for many megafaunal dependent fruits, this is probably not a very plausible way in which they may respond to the extinction of their main seed dispersers. And this is because large mammals disperse seeds from an enormous range of sizes. So for African elephants, they disperse things from the large fruits of borassus to the very tiny kind of fruits of phoenix, for example. However, for many small fruits like the Euterpe edulis, which was studied by Mauro Galetti and colleagues, they're more likely to have substitute seed dispersers and hence, perhaps more likely to kind of adapt once the very largest of those seed dispersers are gone, right? And so following this logic, we argue that large fruits are likely to be at a higher risk of extinction given a tighter dependence on large mammals, right? Because there really isn't that much their loss really is more difficult to compensate with whatever is remaining in the frugivore community. There is a lot of evidence that this is the loss of large megafauna is already having an impact on plant communities. So for example, in this study in 2013, shown by those bar plots at the top, the y-axis is basically the rate of pole recruitment under the parent tree, which can be, so values of 1 would be that on average, every single parent tree will have 1 offspring, for example. So things that are really below that are recruiting at a much lower rate. And they basically showed that African elephant-dependent tree species, the ones indicated in reddish brown, like those are just not being dispersed effectively, and hence, there has been a substantial decline in their population growth rate as a result of the loss of these elephants in these areas. Another example by Red Harrison in 2013 studied like the tropical forest of Lambia in Sarawak, and basically showed through multiple censuses of the tree community there that large fruited or large seeded plant species in general, their spatial kind of patterns are becoming more and more aggregated. So even though there has been no change in their mortality through time that we can detect yet, there is clearly a very strong spatial signature. They're becoming, the loss of large frugivores such as hornbills in the area has really kind of reduced their ability to disperse. And of course, if this lack of dispersal gives rise to long-term declines in population, that could really impact, that could have an impact on the extinction of many of these tree species. And so one of the responses that might have happened since the megafauna extinctions in the late Pleistocene might have been the selective extinction of large fruited palms. Of course, we don't actually we have no evidence of this. One would have to look at the fossil record to see if these palms truly went extinct. But I think it's certainly plausible that this is one of the mechanisms by which plant communities will respond or equilibrate to changes in the frugivore community. However, I think it really depends. So in the neotropics, as you recall earlier, we find that the fruit sizes are equally well explained by the present natural kind of mammal assemblages. And one of the reasons why that might be the case is that the loss of seed dispersal may be compensated by remaining frugivores. So many large fruited palms in the neotropics are thought to have been dispersed by extinct megafauna, such as large elephant-like creatures such as proboscideans, such as gomphotheres. And as a result, some ecologists have kind of called them ecological anachronisms. So species that have kind of evolved for a very different seed dispersal, but are now kind of anachronistic in the sense that they are kind of out of place. The arguments that they make, that some of these ecologists make, are like that many of the fruit crop kind of just fall to the ground and seem to be uneaten and undispersed. For example, the presence of spinescence in some of these species of large fruited palm in the neotropics may also suggest that they evolved under high herbivory kind of pressure. And so they kind of evolved these spines to kind of reduce that from large herbivores that seemingly absent in these forests today. However, many of these megafauna dependent palms still are being dispersed by secondary dispersers such as scatter hoarding agoutis. So there was a study that kind of showed that some of these large seeded plant species may be carried about by these kind of rodents, and to some degree, these rodents actually can disperse these seeds quite a large distance. So using some kind of method where they just leave the seed and then kind of radio tracking them, they found that 35% of this supposedly megafauna palm seeds were moved up to 100 meters. So over tens of thousands of years, it is plausible that such a mechanism might have allowed these palm species to continue existing even after the extinction of their main seed dispersers. So the next question that we wanted to ask was, what is the impact of future defaunation? So given what we know about how palms may have responded or presumably responded to these past extinctions, what does that mean for, the, future kind of extinction of sea dispersers that we are kind of currently accelerating today? So to do this, we kind of relied on the same kind of frugivore fruit size relationship. So given that there is a particular relationship between fruit size and body size of the frugivore at the biogeographic scale, we can then do simulations of what future body size would look like under, as we let kind of extinctions play out, and then we can then use that to project what the fruit size would have to be to keep up with that change, given that relationship, that existing relationship between fruit size and body size. And using this difference between what the fruit size is now and what is the projected fruit size under a defaunated future, that can be like a proxy for defaunation impact. This does not mean that this is an impact that is shared by all members of the palm assemblages in a particular area. Nor does it mean that it will necessarily be realized as we see in the nootropics. But this just gives us a convenient way of being able to quantify the relative strength of or the relative impact of future defaunation in different areas, for example. So to do this, I first had to kind of estimate what is the existing extinction risk of sea dispersers today. So to kind of do this, I looked at changes in IUCN rate list status among mammals. So for example, in the left-hand side, we have a Malay tapir, and it is listed as vulnerable in 1996, but then was upgraded to endangered in 2008. As another example, the Asian elephant was endangered in 1996, and then under the IUCN under like a reevaluation of its conservation status, it has remained as endangered in 2008. So I've used kind of a data set that was put together by a bunch of conservation biologists, one for ungulates and carnivores between and their red list status and their changes or lack thereof between 1975 and 2008. And another one looked at all mammals from 1996 to 2008. I then developed a continuous time Markov chain model that can take into account transition rates between these different states. So for those who are more inclined with molecular methods in their own research, this is kind of similar to some of the models that people use to estimate phylogenies, or more rather look at patterns of mutation from A, T, G, and C, and using that to infer phylogenies. So it's a very, very similar kind of statistical kind of process. I then fit this model using maximum likelihood to the two data sets that I mentioned earlier, and used it to calculate extinction probabilities over a 100-year time frame for each IUCN category. So the beauty of this method is that I can calculate the probabilities of transition from one red list status to any other red list status, and it will take into account all possible ways in which the transitions occur to get from one point to another. So if something goes from vulnerable to endangered, and then endangered back to vulnerable, and then after a certain span of time, it looks like it hasn't changed, it also takes into account the possibility that it has changed and has returned back to its original kind of state. So the maximum likelihood rates of these are quite interesting in of themselves. So for example, the probability of a critically endangered species going extinct in a 100-year time frame is about 20%. So these are based off of actual probabilities of observed extinction in in those two data sets that we see. Whereas the probability of a least concerned species, there is only a 0.1% chance that least concerned species will go extinct within a 100-year time frame. So these extinction probabilities were then used to stochastically simulate body size of these future mammal assemblages. And then we use those future mammal body sizes to then project what the defaunation impact would look like, as I explained earlier. When we did this, we found that future defaunation impact was highest in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So on average, as you can see, it's really, really concentrated in, Southeast Asia, Borneo, for example, and in Africa, it's kind of focused in the Central African kind of region. However, we note that this method is potentially quite conservative because in many cases, many of the large-bodied mammals that we see today are already extinct across many large portions of the range, and their populations are incredibly small, fragmented. And so even though they might still persist in a particular country, they may as well be functionally extinct in many areas. And so, even though we talk about this as some kind of future kind of defaunation impact, in reality, many of these impacts of defaunation are already in process, right? We also found that if you were to look at the absolute magnitude of fruit size change that would be necessary to keep up with this global kind of defaunation, it amounts to about a 4% decrease in fruit size to maintain the current fruit-frugivore relationship. In absolute terms, this is about a 0.2 centimeter average change in fruit size, which is about 2 times higher than the ones reported by that were kind of achieved by Euterpe edulis, as reported by Mauro Galletti. So as mentioned before, like whether or not palms are able to kind of respond to changes in the frugivore community would be really context dependent, right? So large fruited species will probably not see a 0.2 centimeter average. Like if they had any opportunity to kind of change their fruit and seed size, it's probably going to be a lot more to kind of keep up. So these are really assemblage level averages, whereas the species level responses might be quite different. So as a summary, how will defaunation impact palms? As you can see, it really depends. So defaunation will have huge impacts on megafauna dependent species, including the possibility of extinction. But species level responses are probably quite context specific. It really depends on whether whether or not a species is able to change its seed size or fruit size or any other aspects of their fruits to adapt to changes in their frugivore community. It also depends on the ability of the seed dispersal interactions to rewire themselves, right? So whether or not there's any functional redundancy in those interactions, like as we can see in the case for many of the neotropical megafauna, supposedly megafauna palms, the loss of their main seed disperser, has the seed dispersal service has been compensated by much smaller frugivores. And of course, there are tons of indirect and cascading effects, right? So although here we've only looked at the loss of frugivores in particular and their impacts on plant communities, it's not just seed dispersers that are being lost today. It's also the loss of large carnivores or medium-sized carnivores. And the loss of these carnivores may give rise to all kinds of downstream effects, like, for example, in Singapore, the loss of very large, where I come from and where I am currently, the loss of large of carnivores has allowed for the population of wild boar to really increase. And wild boar is quite a prolific kind of seed predator, and so indirectly through the loss of these carnivores, you could have increased predation of seeds and hence a reduction in the recruitment of certain plants that if the wild boar is preferentially selecting for those plants, for example. And so the long-term population and ecosystem level consequences of defaunation are really still a very open question. So in this study, we've really looked at it from a very broad perspective, macroecological perspective. But I think to really really look at the conservation of many of these large-fruited palms would require, a much closer examination into their, their population dynamics and their in their respective ecological settings, for example. And I think that there is a lot of work that we have to do as ecologists and as palm lovers to address those gaps. And to do that, I would like to acknowledge, my collaborators, Daniel Kisling, as I mentioned, who I worked with for this project, Jens Christian Svenning at Aarhus, and Soren Forby at the University of Gothenburg. And I would like to acknowledge funding from the postdoctoral fellowship that I'm currently on, and also the NVO for funding some of these palm-related kind of projects. So, and with that, I would like to thank everyone for your attention. I wish everybody well and safe given the global pandemic situation, and I really look forward to the day where we all can meet in person again. So with that, I'll see you guys. Thank you. Bye.